The auditorium smelled faintly of old wood and stage dust. Rows of people filled the seats, talking in low voices as the local music competition was about to begin. It was one of those yearly events the whole town came to see, where children from different schools showed what they could do. Some played piano, some sang, some came with shiny violins and proud parents sitting in the front row. Everyone seemed ready to cheer for their own. At the very back, a thin girl sat quietly with her violin case on her lap. She didn't have fancy clothes or a parent holding her hand. Her dress was plain, neatly ironed but clearly old. Her fingers kept brushing against the rough edge of the violin case as if she was calming herself. She wasn't afraid of the music. She was afraid of the people, of what they might think. She had practiced for months every night after finishing her homework, sometimes until midnight. Her small room didn't have much, just a bed, a wooden chair, and the little table where she practiced. The sound of her bow would fill the silence of the house, sometimes soft, sometimes full of mistakes. But she never gave up. She dreamed of this competition. She dreamed that maybe if she played well, someone would see her talent. When her name was called, she took a slow breath and stood up. The crowd barely noticed her at first. She walked carefully to the stage, holding the violin close to her chest. The bright lights hit her face and made her blink. She stood in front of the microphone, her heart pounding so loud that she could almost hear it echoing in her ears. For a moment, she looked into the crowd. People were whispering. Some were smiling, not the kind of smile that encourages, but the kind that says, "Let's see what this one can do." In the first row, a few other contestants giggled quietly, covering their mouths. One boy leaned to his friend and said something, and both laughed softly. She tried not to notice. She lifted her bow and set it gently on the strings. Her hands trembled. The first note came out sharp and uneven. The sound bounced awkwardly off the walls. A few people in the audience looked at each other and smirked. She tried again, focusing on the melody she knew by heart, but her fingers felt stiff, like they didn't belong to her body. The more she thought about the people watching, the worse it got. A nervous squeak came from the violin, an ugly sound that didn't belong in the song. A burst of laughter came from somewhere in the crowd. Her throat tightened. She looked down, her eyes burning, her fingers frozen on the strings. She tried to start again, forcing herself to breathe, but her mind was blank. The piece she had practiced so many times was gone. The laughter spread, not loud but enough to fill her ears. Even the judges looked uncomfortable. One of them adjusted his glasses, another tapped a pen impatiently. She could feel her face turning red. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "You can do this." She tried one last time. The bow touched the strings again, and this time a few soft notes came out, uneven, trembling, but honest. The melody started to form, fragile but real. For a few seconds it almost sounded like what she had practiced. But her voice inside had already broken. The fear had won. Her hand slipped and the bow fell to the floor. A soft clatter echoed in the silent hall. The laughter stopped for a second. Then came the awkward sound of someone clearing their throat. She quickly picked up the bow, but the humiliation was already too heavy. Her eyes stung and she couldn't see through the tears anymore. Without saying a word, she lowered her violin and turned away from the microphone. As she walked off the stage, someone in the back whispered, "Poor thing." Another said, "She shouldn't have even tried." The words cut deeper than anything. She kept walking, her steps quick, her head low. Her vision swam, and all she could think about was getting out of that place. She pushed open the side door of the auditorium and stepped into the cool evening air. The sound of laughter still echoed in her ears. The sun was setting, and the orange light fell over the empty benches outside. She sat down on one, placed her violin case beside her, and covered her face with her hands. Her chest heaved as she tried to hold back her sobs, but the tears came anyway. They fell quietly at first, then freely. She had dreamed of applause, of people clapping for her music. But instead they had laughed. She didn't know what hurt more, the mistakes she made or the way they made her feel small. After a while, the door opened and an older woman came out, the janitor who cleaned the auditorium after events. She saw the girl sitting alone and walked over. "You played, didn't you?" she asked softly. The girl nodded, still wiping her face. "It didn't go well," she whispered. The woman sat beside her, not saying much. She looked at the violin case and said, "You know, every great player I've ever seen has a story like this. Nobody starts perfect. Some people just don't see the heart behind the sound." The girl didn't respond right away. She stared at the sky where the first star was starting to appear. "They laughed at me," she finally said. Her voice cracked. "They didn't even give me a chance." The woman nodded slowly. "Then prove them wrong," she said. "One day make them listen. Not with anger, but with music they can't forget." The girl looked at her violin case again. It had scratches, the strings were worn, and the bow was slightly frayed at the edges. But it was hers. It was the only thing that ever made her feel alive. She opened the case, lifted the violin, and touched the strings gently. The wood felt warm from the sun. She raised it to her chin, closed her eyes, and began to play. The sound was soft, raw, and full of feeling. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The notes drifted into the empty air, and the woman beside her listened quietly, smiling. For a moment, the world felt peaceful again. When she finished, the woman said, "That's the sound that will change everything one day." The girl didn't answer, but inside her heart something began to stir, a small spark of determination that refused to die. Maybe she wasn't ready yet. Maybe she still had a long way to go. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let their laughter be the end of her story. That night she went home quietly. Her mother was waiting, sitting by the window. When she saw the look on her daughter's face, she didn't ask any questions. She just opened her arms and the girl fell into them, crying again. "It's okay," her mother whispered. "They don't see what I see." The girl nodded through her tears. "I'll get better," she said softly. "I promise." Her mother kissed her forehead. "I know you will." Later that night, when the house was quiet and the world outside had gone to sleep, the girl took out her violin again. Her fingers were still shaky, but she began to play. Slowly, gently, she found the melody again, the same one she had ruined on stage. But this time there was no laughter, no crowd, no pressure, only her instrument, and the sound of her own heartbeat. Each note was a step toward something new. She didn't realize it yet, but that night was the beginning of everything. The humiliation she felt would one day become the memory that fueled her greatness. The crowd that laughed would one day rise to their feet. For now she just played under the dim light, her eyes half closed, her soul pouring into every sound. The music was quiet, but it carried strength. It carried hope. It carried the story that was only just beginning. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the small cracks of the window and touched her face. She opened her eyes slowly, remembering the night before. The sound of laughter from the crowd still echoed somewhere deep in her chest. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, but when she saw her violin resting on the chair beside her bed, everything came rushing back. Her mother was already up, preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of fried eggs filled the air. The girl sat on the edge of her bed staring at her hands. They looked the same, but something inside her had changed. She wasn't just sad, she was angry. Not at the people who laughed, but at herself for letting fear control her. She went to the kitchen quietly. Her mother turned around and smiled, though her eyes carried worry. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. The girl hesitated before answering. "I don't want to stop," she said. "I know I can do better." Her mother nodded. "Then keep going," she said gently. "But do it for yourself, not for them." After breakfast, she opened her violin case again. The bow still had a few broken hairs, but she didn't care. She spent hours playing, making mistakes and correcting them again and again. Her fingers grew sore, but she didn't stop. Every wrong note reminded her of the laughter she had heard. Every time her bow slipped, she remembered the faces in the crowd. She used those memories as fuel. Days passed like this. School, home, music, and that was her world. She didn't have many friends. Some classmates still teased her quietly about the competition. They'd say things like, "Hey, don't squeak like that violin girl." She would keep her head down and keep walking. When she got home, she didn't let their words sit inside her. She would take out her violin and play until she couldn't hear anything else. The music became her voice. It was the only way she knew how to answer the world. Her mother often stood by the door, watching quietly. Sometimes she wanted to tell her to rest, but she knew better. She knew that fire inside her daughter needed to burn. She could see the pain slowly turning into strength. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the air grew colder, The girl walked to a nearby park with her violin. She sat on an old bench under a tree and started to play softly. The notes floated through the air like whispers. A few people passing by slowed down to listen. No one laughed. A little boy even dropped a coin near her feet. She smiled for the first time in days. That single moment meant more than any trophy or competition could give. Someone had stopped not to judge, but to listen. After that, she started going to the park often. It became her practice place. Open sky, fresh air, and strangers who didn't know her story. She began learning how to play not just with her hands, but with her heart. She started to understand what her mother meant when she said, "Play for yourself." Sometimes she stayed until the streetlights came on. The world around her faded into the background whenever she played. Her music became her world, a place where she didn't have to be perfect, only honest. One night, her mother found her still awake past midnight, practicing a new piece she had learned online. "You need rest," her mother said gently. The girl shook her head. "Just a little more." "I almost have it right," her mother smiled. "All right, but remember, music should never feel like punishment. It should heal you." Those words stayed with her. From then on, whenever she felt tired or frustrated, she would close her eyes and let her heart guide the music. Slowly, the sound began to change. It wasn't shaky anymore. It was deep, confident, and alive. Months passed and seasons changed. Her hands grew stronger, her posture straighter, her sound richer. Sometimes her mother would listen from the next room and quietly wipe tears from her eyes. The girl didn't know it, but she was no longer just playing notes. She was learning how to speak through her music. One afternoon, while she was practicing at the park, an older man stopped to listen. He stood silently for a long time, leaning on his cane. When she finished, he clapped softly. "That was beautiful," he said. The girl thanked him shyly. The man smiled. "Do you play anywhere else?" She shook her head. "No, just here." "I'm not good enough for anything else," he laughed gently. "You sound better than most I've heard on the radio. You have feeling. That's something you can't teach." His words stayed with her long after he left. For the first time, she began to believe maybe she wasn't just chasing a dream. Maybe she had something real inside her. At night, she lay awake thinking about the man's words. Her mind went back to that day on stage, the laughter, the embarrassment. She still felt the sting, but now it didn't hurt the same way. It felt like a lesson, one she needed to learn. She started recording herself using an old phone her mother gave her. Each time she played, she listened carefully to find mistakes. She worked on her tone, her timing, her control. She began to notice how emotion changed the sound, how sadness made the notes softer, how hope made them rise. She studied music videos online, watching how great violinists expressed their feelings through every movement. Sometimes, she didn't even realize how much time had passed. She would start playing after dinner and notice the first light of morning before she stopped. The neighbors began to hear her too. At first, they were annoyed by the endless practice, but over time they noticed the change. The sound that once cracked and wavered now carried strength. The notes felt alive. They began to wait for her evening practice, listening quietly from their balconies. One day, as she was leaving for school, one of the neighbors stopped her. "You play beautifully," the woman said. "I sit by my window and listen every night. It's the best part of my day." The girl felt shy but smiled. That single sentence filled her with warmth. It meant her music was reaching hearts even if she didn't know it. Still, she knew she wasn't ready yet. Every time she looked at her violin, she remembered the promise she made to herself the night she cried outside the auditorium. That she would never let laughter define her again. She practiced harder. Her mother sometimes found her sleeping with her violin beside her. Her fingers often had small cuts from the strings, but she didn't mind. Pain didn't scare her anymore. Failure didn't either. Then one afternoon, something happened that would change her path again. She was playing at the park as usual, when a young man filming street performances approached her. He asked if he could record her playing for his channel. She agreed, not expecting anything. He recorded her as she played one of her favorite emotional pieces, the same one she had tried to perform at the competition years ago. He thanked her, posted it online that night, and went on his way. She forgot about it completely, until a few days later when her phone began to buzz again and again. Messages poured in. People were sharing her video everywhere. Comments came from strangers around the world. Some said her music made them cry. Others said they could feel her story through the notes. She couldn't believe it. The same song that once brought her humiliation was now touching thousands of hearts. Her mother watched her reaction with tears in her eyes. "See," she said softly. "I told you. One day they would listen." The girl smiled through her tears. She wasn't famous yet, not even close. But that moment felt like a quiet victory. A small proof that pain can turn into beauty if you don't give up. That night she stood by her window, looking out at the stars. The town lights shimmered below and the world felt bigger than ever. She held her violin close and whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." Then she played, not for the crowd, not for applause, but for her younger self, the girl who once stood on a stage and trembled. The notes rose into the night, soft and full of promise. Somewhere deep inside she knew that one day the same crowd that laughed would listen again. But this time, they would not laugh. They would bow. The morning after her video went viral, everything felt unreal. Her phone kept buzzing with messages and notifications. People she didn't know were sending words of kindness. Messages from strangers saying how her music made them cry, how it touched something deep inside them. Some said her song reminded them of their own struggles, their own quiet dreams. At first she didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to attention. The same world that had once laughed at her was now clapping for her from behind screens. It felt strange but beautiful. She showed her mother, who looked at the screen for a long time, silent at first, then smiling with tears in her eyes. "You see," her mother said softly, "when you play with your heart, the world listens." The girl nodded, still trying to believe it. She wasn't sure what this meant for her, but she knew one thing. She had found her voice. Within a few days, local news reporters wanted to meet her. They asked if they could interview her, film her playing live. The first time a reporter came to their small home, the girl was nervous. She didn't know what to say or how to act, but once she started playing, the nervousness disappeared. The violin always spoke better than she could. The sound filled the little room. The cameraman lowered his camera for a moment, just listening. When she finished, there was silence, followed by quiet applause. The next day, her face appeared on the local news with a headline calling her the girl whose music silenced the internet. People began to recognize her when she went to the market or walked through the park. Some would stop and say, "Aren't you the girl from that video?" She would smile shyly and nod. She didn't feel like a star, but she felt seen, maybe for the first time in her life. Her days became full of new things. She started receiving messages from people who wanted her to perform at small events, schools, and charity shows. The first time she played in front of an audience again, she stood on the same kind of stage she once feared. But this time, there was no laughter. The crowd listened quietly, their faces soft, their eyes following her every movement. The first note she played trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. As she continued, she could feel her heart open through the music. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about sharing what she loved. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. She bowed, tears filling her eyes. After the show, a teacher came up to her and said, "You've reminded my students what it means to believe in something." That sentence stayed in her mind for days. She realized her music wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Her schedule slowly filled up. She was invited to play at nearby cities, sometimes even at small radio stations. The world that once ignored her now wanted to hear more. Every stage felt different, but one thing never changed. She carried the memory of that first failure with her, not as pain, but as strength. Sometimes after a performance, she would sit quietly in her dressing room, holding her violin and remembering that day, the bright lights, the laughter, the way her hands had shaken, and then she would smile. Because without that moment, she might never have learned what real courage was. One evening, as she packed up after a show, a well-dressed man approached her. He introduced himself as a representative of a well-known music academy. "We've been following your journey," he said. "We'd like to offer you a scholarship to study with us." Her hands froze. She stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. A scholarship. Her heart raced. She had always dreamed of learning professionally, but she never imagined someone would actually give her the chance. That night, she told her mother, who hugged her tightly. "You worked for this," her mother whispered. "You earned it." Leaving home wasn't easy. The town where she grew up held every memory, both painful and beautiful. The night before she left, she walked through the empty park where she had played for strangers. The wind was soft, carrying the faint scent of grass and rain. She took out her violin one last time and played quietly under the old tree. The melody floated through the night. The same song she had once played in tears, now filled with calm confidence. When she arrived at the academy, the world looked different. The campus was large, with wide halls and rooms filled with instruments. Everywhere she looked, people were practicing. Violins, pianos, cellos. At first, she felt out of place. Many of the students came from rich families. Their instruments were new, their clothes elegant. She still had her old violin with scratches along the side, but it was hers and she wasn't ashamed of it. The teachers were strict but kind. They saw her potential. During lessons, she listened carefully, taking notes, absorbing every word. She stayed late in the practice rooms long after everyone else had gone home. The janitor who cleaned the building would sometimes pass by and say, "Still here?" And she would smile and nod. She wanted to learn everything, not just how to play better, but how to feel every note. Her music began to change again. It became deeper, more expressive. The other students started to notice. Some of them who had once ignored her began to ask, "How do you make your playing sound so emotional?" She would just smile and say, "Because I remember what it feels like to be silent." Months turned into years. She performed at student concerts, often receiving the loudest applause. Her teachers praised her dedication. One day, her mentor told her, "You have something rare, not just skill but soul. Don't ever lose that." Still, she never forgot where she came from. Whenever she went back home during holidays, she visited the same park, playing for anyone who would listen. The children would gather around, their eyes wide. She always smiled at them, knowing that maybe one of them would find courage through her music the way she once did. One evening, while practicing at the academy, she received a letter in the mail. It was an invitation to perform as a special guest at the annual music competition in her hometown. The same one where she had once failed. Her hands trembled as she read it. It felt like life had come full circle. She sat quietly for a long time, staring at the invitation. Part of her wanted to decline, not out of fear, but because she didn't know if she was ready to face those memories again. But deep down, she knew she had to. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about closure and gratitude. That night, she played until dawn. The sound of her violin filled the empty practice room. The same bow that once slipped from her hands now moved like it was part of her. The music rose, fierce and alive, echoing through the halls like a promise. She thought about all the people who had been kind along the way. Her mother, the janitor, the man who filmed her, the strangers who had listened and believed. Each one had added something to her journey. As the morning light touched her face, she lowered her violin and whispered to herself, "I'll go back." The decision was made. She would return to the place where it all began. The same stage, the same town, but a completely different version of herself. When the day finally came, she packed her violin carefully. Her mother waited by the door, smiling proudly. "Play with your heart," she said. "That's all you ever needed." The girl nodded, hugged her mother, and stepped out into the sunlight. The road ahead was long, but her steps were steady. She wasn't the nervous girl who once trembled in front of a crowd. She was the musician who had turned pain into purpose. And as the bus carried her toward her hometown, she looked out the window and smiled softly. Somewhere deep inside, she could already hear the sound of applause, not from pride but from peace. Because this time, when she stepped on that stage, she knew she wouldn't just be playing notes. She would be telling her story, the story of a girl who refused to stay silent. The town looked almost the same when she returned, yet everything felt different. The streets were still narrow, the shops still small, and the same children still ran past laughing as they had years ago. But she had changed. She carried herself with quiet confidence now, the kind that comes from long nights of hard work and countless moments of doubt overcome. The old auditorium stood at the edge of town, just like she remembered it. The walls were freshly painted, but the wooden steps still creaked under her feet when she walked up. As she entered, a familiar scent of polish and dust filled the air. Her heart beat faster. It had been years, but memories of that painful day returned. The laughter, the stares, the sting of humiliation. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wasn't that frightened girl anymore. She had earned her place here not through luck but through effort, pain, and endless nights of practice. When she walked into the hall, people were already preparing for the event. Technicians adjusted the lights and sound checks echoed faintly through the room. She was greeted by a man who seemed to recognize her. "You must be the special guest performer," he said warmly. "We're honored to have you. Everyone's been talking about your return." She smiled politely, though a small tremor of nerves still lived somewhere inside her. "Thank you," she replied softly. He showed her to a small dressing room at the back of the stage. Inside there was a mirror surrounded by lights, a wooden chair, and a small table with a bottle of water. She placed her violin case on the table and sat down. The reflection staring back at her in the mirror looked calm, but her heart whispered otherwise. She opened her violin case and ran her fingers along the instrument. It still had the same little scratch from years ago, a mark from the day her bow fell in front of everyone. She smiled faintly at it. Once that scratch reminded her of shame. Now it reminded her of strength. Outside, the audience began to arrive. The sounds of laughter, conversation, and footsteps filled the hall. She could hear the faint echoes of excitement. Some of the same people who once laughed at her were likely sitting in those seats again, unaware that the girl they mocked years ago was now the performer they came to hear. As the event began, she stood backstage listening to the other performers. They were talented and pianists, singers, violinists, all nervous but hopeful. When her turn approached, her palms began to sweat. She closed her eyes and whispered quietly, "Play from your heart, not for applause." The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a special guest. A musician who once stood on this very stage years ago, not as a guest but as a young contestant. Many of you might remember her, though the story that began here has now reached far beyond our town. Please welcome." The sound of her name rolled through the hall, followed by polite applause. She took one deep breath, adjusted her violin, and walked onto the stage. The lights hit her face again, the same brightness she had once feared. She blinked against it, and for a brief second, she saw the audience not as they were now, but as they had been that day, whispering, laughing, watching her stumble. But this time she stood tall. The hall fell silent. Not a whisper, not a cough. Every eye was on her. She lifted her violin to her chin, placed her bow on the strings, and began to play. The first note floated through the air like a whisper, clear, gentle, full of emotion. Then came the next and the next, each one building on the last. Her fingers moved gracefully. Her bow glided across the strings with precision and feeling. The music filled every corner of the hall, wrapping around the audience like a story told without words. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in. Some closed their eyes. The melody rose higher, soft at first, then powerful, filled with years of pain, growth, and triumph. Every note carried a piece of her journey. The laughter she endured, the nights she practiced until her fingers bled, the small moments of encouragement from strangers, and the quiet faith of her mother. Her eyes glistened as she played. She wasn't performing to prove anything. She was speaking through her music, telling the story of every person who had ever been doubted, who had ever been laughed at but refused to give up. As the piece neared its end, she let the final notes linger in the air. They seemed to hang for a moment, shimmering with emotion before fading into silence. For a long second, no one moved. The hall was utterly still. Then slowly, people began to rise. One person clapped, then another, until the entire room was on its feet. The sound of applause thundered through the hall, louder than she had ever heard before. Tears blurred her vision. She bowed deeply, her heart full. She could see faces she recognized from years ago, people who had once laughed, now wiping their eyes, clapping with genuine admiration. Among them, she spotted one of the judges from her first performance. He looked older now, his expression soft. When she met his gaze, he placed his hand over his heart and nodded. She smiled faintly and nodded back. The applause continued for what felt like forever. When she finally walked off the stage, her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from emotion. In the hallway backstage, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. A few moments later, the event organizer came rushing over. "That was incredible," he said. "You've moved everyone here. They can't stop talking about you." She smiled, still trying to find words. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means more than you know." Before leaving the hall, she decided to walk onto the empty stage one last time. The audience had already gone, and the silence felt peaceful now. She stood in the same spot where she once dropped her bow. The memory of that moment flashed before her eyes, the laughter, the tears, the humiliation. And then she looked around the hall, remembering how the same walls that once echoed with laughter had just echoed with applause. She whispered softly to herself, "You did it." Her mother was waiting outside. When she saw her, she opened her arms and they hugged tightly. "I told you," her mother whispered. "The world would listen one day." They walked together down the street toward home. The night was cool and the town lights shimmered gently. People who passed by smiled and waved, some even stopping to thank her for her performance. She was tired, but her heart was light. For the first time she felt complete, not because she had been praised, but because she had faced the very thing that once broke her and turned it into something beautiful. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window with her violin resting in her lap, the moonlight touching the strings. She played softly just for herself, slow, tender notes that filled the quiet room. Her mother listened from the next room, smiling to herself. Every note she played felt like a heartbeat, like a story still unfolding. She thought of all the times she wanted to give up, all the nights she questioned herself, all the small moments of kindness that kept her going. Every bit of it had brought her here. She realized that success wasn't just about talent or applause. It was about patience, about pain, about learning how to stand again after falling. The world that once made her cry had now bowed to her music, not out of pity but out of respect. And as she played into the night, she felt something she had never felt before: peace. She knew now that no matter where life took her, she would always carry that stage, that song, and that lesson inside her heart. The sound of her violin faded softly into the night air. Outside, the same stars that once watched her cry now watched her shine. And though no one else could hear it, she smiled, knowing this was not the end of her story. It was just the moment when her music finally became her voice. The morning air was crisp as she stepped outside. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the streets in soft orange and gold. Today was different. Today she would visit the school where it all began. The same place where children had once whispered and laughed when she stumbled on stage, where she had felt so small and humiliated. Her violin case was worn, but it was hers, carrying every note she had ever played, every mistake she had ever made, and every triumph she had earned. She held it carefully, as if carrying the past and the future in one hand. As she approached the school, memories came flooding back. She remembered walking into the auditorium with trembling hands, trying to hide her fear. She remembered the laughter that had echoed in her ears and the tears she had cried in the empty streets afterward. Back then she had felt powerless, like her dreams were too big for a world that wasn't ready to listen. But now, years later, the world had changed, and so had she. The doors of the school auditorium opened and she was greeted warmly by the staff. Many of the teachers remembered her from the old competitions. Some had tears in their eyes when they saw her standing there, confident and strong. A few whispered to each other, shaking their heads in quiet amazement. She was led to the stage, the same stage where it had all happened. The wooden floorboards creaked slightly under her weight. She smiled faintly. Once, those creaks had sounded like warnings, but now they felt like friends welcoming her back. Students began to file in, filling the seats. She noticed some of the children fidgeting, whispering to each other, probably curious about the performer who had returned to their school. She walked past them with a gentle smile, nodding softly. No one laughed. No one whispered mean words. The principal stepped onto the stage, welcoming her and introducing her to the audience. Today we have a very special guest. Many years ago, she performed here as a young student, facing challenges and doubts. Today she returns, not just as a performer, but as an inspiration for every one of you who has a dream. She bowed politely, feeling the weight of her journey. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about sharing something greater: hope, courage, and the truth that determination could overcome even the deepest pain. She lifted her violin, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first note rang out pure and strong, cutting through the still air of the auditorium. Then another and another, each one telling a story without words. Her fingers moved gracefully across the strings, her bow gliding with precision and emotion. Every note carried years of struggle. Every melody reflected her growth, and every pause whispered the silent strength she had built inside herself. As she played, the students sat quietly, rapt. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, completely absorbed in the music. A few older teachers had tears in their eyes. She played not to impress them, not to show that she had succeeded, but to remind them all, and herself, that every struggle could transform into something beautiful. The piece built slowly, like a wave rising in the ocean, soft at first, then gaining power and intensity. She remembered the first time she had tried to play on this stage, the trembling hands, the laughter from the audience. But now that memory fueled her instead of frightening her. Every note she played was a tribute to her younger self, the girl who had cried but never given up. The final notes approached, soft and lingering, like the last rays of the sun at dusk. She let the music stretch, filling every corner of the auditorium. When the last sound faded, silence held the room for a long, beautiful moment. Then slowly, applause began. One hand clapped, then another, until the hall erupted into cheers. Students stood up, clapping with admiration. Teachers wiped away tears, and some even whispered words of awe. For the first time, she realized something remarkable. This applause wasn't just for her music. It was for the journey, for the courage to keep going when everything seemed impossible. It was for the girl who had once left the stage in tears, and for the woman who had returned with strength. After the performance, the principal invited her to speak. She stepped forward, holding her violin close, and spoke quietly at first. When I first played here, I was scared. I made mistakes. People laughed. I wanted to hide and forget that day forever. But my mother, my teachers, and even strangers I didn't know reminded me to keep going. I practiced every day, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to find my own voice. And today I'm here to tell you, never let anyone else's laughter define your story. You are stronger than you think, and your dreams are worth every tear and every effort. The students listened, completely silent, taking in her words. Some nodded slowly as if understanding the truth behind them. Later, she walked around the school, visiting classrooms and sharing music with the children. She played short pieces for small groups, letting them try the violin, encouraging them to explore sound and feel. She could see their eyes light up when they touched the strings, just as her own had once lit up with wonder. The day ended with her walking back onto the stage one last time, alone. She played a quiet, tender piece, one she had written herself. The melody was soft, full of hope, and spoke of dreams that refused to die. The hall was empty now, but the music carried far beyond walls and windows, touching the hearts of anyone who listened. When she finally put her violin down, she felt a peace she had never known. It wasn't about applause or recognition anymore. It was about the journey, the courage to face fear, and the power of persistence. She thought of the girl she had once been, small, nervous, unsure. She thought of every moment she had practiced alone, every night she had refused to give up, and she smiled, because she knew something important. That little girl had grown into someone stronger, someone who could face the world without fear, someone whose music could touch hearts. As she walked out of the auditorium and into the cool evening air, the town seemed to embrace her. People waved, some stopped to say hello, and she returned each greeting with a soft smile. She had returned not just as the girl who had failed, but as a symbol of courage, perseverance, and hope. She thought about the crowd that had once mocked her. She imagined them watching her now, seeing her perform not with mistakes, but with mastery, confidence, and soul. They would remember, perhaps with a sense of awe, how someone they had doubted had grown into someone remarkable. But she didn't need their acknowledgement anymore. The real reward was inside her, the knowledge that she had faced fear, overcome it, and found her own voice. That night, she returned home. The house was quiet, and she went to her room, placing her violin carefully on the table. She sat by the window looking out at the stars. She thought about her journey, from the laughter that had once hurt so deeply to the applause and respect she now received. Every challenge, every tear, every small act of courage had led her here. She lifted her violin one last time and played softly, just for herself. The notes were tender, full of love and peace. The music drifted into the night air, mingling with the quiet sounds of the town. She closed her eyes and felt gratitude for her mother, for the strangers who had listened, for the people who had doubted her, because even they had shaped her into who she was. As the final note faded, she whispered to herself, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me play and for letting me grow." From that night on, she knew her journey would continue, that her music would always be her voice, and that the courage she had found inside herself could never be taken away. The crowd that once mocked her had bowed, yes, but more importantly, she had found her own strength, and that strength would guide her forever. She went to sleep that night with a heart full of peace, knowing that every note she had ever played had mattered. Every failure had led to growth, every tear to courage, and every small dream to a life that was now brighter than she had ever imagined. And in that quiet, simple moment, she finally understood the truth she had been chasing all along, that the music we carry in our hearts is stronger than the laughter of the world, and that the voice of persistence will always find a way to be heard.